Trucker Smurf, take one.
Alright, when I come to the front side of my cab, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick overview, make sure that there's no signs of fresh damage. I'm then going to check my clearance lights. My clearance lights are properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken, amber in color. I'm going to then call out my identification lights. My identification lights are the three lights in the middle, right up here. I'm going to make sure that they're properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken, amber in color. I'm then going to call out my headlights. On both sides, they're properly mounted and secured. White, clear, and in color, not cracked or broken. I'm going to call out my pit lights on the side here. My pit lights are properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken, amber in color. I'm then going to check up underneath my truck, make sure there's no signs of excessive leaks. I'm going to do 3 points of contact. 1, 2, and 3. Pull up my hood. Alright, I'm going to walk to my passenger side engine compartment. First thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to call out, make sure there's no signs of fresh damage on my passenger side engine compartment. I'm going to call out my coolant reservoir. My coolant reservoir is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. No signs of leaks. Filled to the proper level. I'm going to make sure that my coolant reservoir cap is properly mounted and secured and present. I'm going to then call out my reservoir hose. My reservoir hose is properly mounted and secured. No signs of abrasions, bulges, or cuts, and no signs of dry rot. I'm going to call out my alternator. My alternator is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. I'm going to then call out properly mounted and secured. I'm going to then call out my jam nut. My jam nut is properly mounted and secured. No sign and present. I'm going to then call out my belt. My belt is properly mounted and secured. No abrasions, bulges, or cuts. 3/4 inch of play. I'm going to then call out my water pump. My water pump is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. No signs of leaks. Alright. Then I'm going to call out my exhaust. My exhaust is properly mounted and secured. No signs of black soot, which would indicate exhaust leak or oil leak from your turbo. And that is it for the passenger side. And then come to my driver's side engine compartment. Make sure, do a quick overview, make sure there's no signs of fresh damage. I'm going to go over my firewall hoses. Make sure my firewall hoses are properly mounted and secured. No signs of abrasions, bulges, or cuts. No signs of dry rot. I'm going to then call out my steering rod. My steering rod is properly mounted and secured. Not bent, cracked, or broken. I'm going to then call out my steering rod knuckle. My steering rod knuckle is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts, properly greased. I'm going to then call out my gearbox. My gearbox is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts, no signs of leaks. I'm going to go on up here to my power steering reservoir. My power steering reservoir is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts, and no signs of leaks. I'm going to call out my power steering reservoir cap and dipstick. Make sure they're properly mounted and secured and present. If I do not have a dipstick, I will take my cap off my power steering pump and I will eyeball it. Make sure it's filled. I'm going to call out my power steering reservoir hose. My power steering reservoir hose. Make sure it's properly mounted and secured. No abrasions, bulges, or cuts, and no signs of dry rot. I'm going to come up to my engine oil cap. My engine oil cap is properly mounted and secured and present. Then I'm going to come back here to my my air compressor. My air compressor is properly mounted and secured. Not missing any nuts or bolts, and internally gear driven. I'm going to call out my engine oil dipstick. My engine oil dipstick is properly mounted and secured and present In order for me to check my engine oil dipstick, I have to pull it out, wipe it clean, stick it back in, pull it back out. Make sure it's between the add and fill line. Add and full line. And I would measure it out in gallons, not quarts. Then I'm going to come down to my pitman arm. My pitman arm is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. My castle nut and cotter pin are present. I'm going to then call out my drag link. My drag link is properly mounted and secured. No signs of properly mounted and secured. Not bent, cracked, or broken. Then I'm going to call out my other pitman arm, which would be a rear pitman arm. My rear pitman arm is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. Castle nut and cotter pin are present. Then I'm going to come all the way back here, and I'm going to talk about my tie rod. My tie rod is properly mounted and secured. Not bent, cracked, or broken. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. Then I'm going to talk about my suspension system. My suspension system should go something like this. My control arm mount leads to my control arm. My control arm leads to my U-bolts. My U-bolts leads to my shock absorber. My shock absorber leads to my airbag. So this is how you would call it out. I'm going to call out my control arm mount. Make sure it's properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. I'm going to then call out my control arm. My control arm is properly mounted and secured. Not bent, cracked, or broken. I'm going to then call out my U-bolt. My U-bolts are properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. If I am missing a bolt, then it's not properly mounted and secured. I'm going to call out my shock absorber. My shock absorber is properly mounted and secured. Not bent, cracked, or broken. And no signs of leaks. I'm going to call out my airbag. My airbag is properly mounted and secured. No abrasions, bulges, or cuts. And no signs of dry rot. Alright? Then I'm going to call out my brake system. My brake system goes like this. I'm going to call out my air hose. My air hose is properly mounted and secured. No signs of abrasions, bulges, or cuts, and no signs of dry rot. I'm going to call out my brake chamber. My brake chamber is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. I'm going to then call out my push rod and slack adjuster. My push rod and slack adjuster are properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts or pins and keys. And how I would check my push rod and slack adjuster, I would park on level ground, chalk my wheels. I will then disengage my brakes, my tractor and my trailer brakes. I would push on it, and I should have no more than 1 inch of play. Alright? I'm going to then call out my brake drum. My brake drum is properly mounted and secured. No signs of illegal welds, clear of debris, and no signs of leaks. I would then call out my brake pads. My brake pads are properly mounted and secured. No more than 1/4 inch thick, squared, not rounded, not cracked or broken. No signs of leaks. I would then go to my tire assembly. My tire assembly, I'm going to call out my inner and outer walls. Make sure that there's no signs of abrasions, bulges, or cuts, or dry rot. I would then call out my tire tread. My tire tread has to be even tire treads. Virgin tire. This cannot be recapped. 4/32 seconds tire tread depth. I'm going to then talk about that it's properly beaded to my rim. Then I'm going to go into my rim. My rim is properly mounted and secured, not cracked or bent or broken. No signs of illegal welds. I'm going to then call out my lug nuts. My lug nuts are properly mounted and secured, and all present. No signs of shiny rust trails or shiny threads, which would indicate looseness. And I would have to use a commercial lug nut wrench to check that, or to tighten them up. I'm going to then call out my hub seal. My hub seal is properly mounted and secured. No signs of leaks, and I cannot check this. I have to have a certified mechanic check it. I'm going to call out my valve stem cover. My valve stem is properly mounted and secured and present. My valve stem cover is metal. It cannot be hard plastic or rubber. And in order for me to fill up my tire to the right pressure, I would have to fill it up with a commercial air gauge and filled to the proper specs printed on the side of the trailer, on the side of the tire. Now I'm going to close my hood.
Future Truckers of America, Asheboro, North Carolina. 8,610-3777.
All right. I'm going to then call out my side of my tractor on my driver's side. Make sure that there's no signs of fresh damage. I'm going to then walk over here. I'm going to pull onto my mirror, make sure it's properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts, not cracked or broken, and clean. Then I'm going to open up my door. My door is properly mounted and secured. No signs of play. I'm going to then call out my door hinges. My door hinges are properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. I'm then going to call out my weather seal around my door. My weather seal around my door is properly mounted and secured. No signs of abrasions, bulges, or cuts, and no signs of dry rot. I'm going to then call out my stairs. My stairs are properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts, not cracked, bent, or broken. No signs of debris that would cause me to trip, slip, or fall. I'm going to then call out my pet light. My pet light is properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken, amber in color. Now, most trucks, if you have your own truck, you can call these out. These are grab handles, but for test purposes only, you do not have to call these out. They will not give you points, and they will not take away points. I'm going to call out my dog box. My dog box is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. These are part of your hinges. You do not have to call these out, but you can say that they're not bent, cracked, or broken, or leaking. Inside my dog box, I should have 3 triangles, a box of spare fuses, and a fire extinguisher. Fire extinguisher is 5 BC or 10 BC if you're hazmat. Then I'm going to do a quick overview of my fuel tank. My fuel tank is, there's no signs of fresh damage. I'm going to step back, make sure I don't see any leaks. No excessive leaks up under my fuel tank. Alright, I'm going to call out my fuel tank straps, or you can call them supports, however you want to call them out. I'm going to make sure that they're rubber to metal, not metal to metal. I'm going to call out that my fuel tank cap is present. Pull it out, make sure I have a T-bar and a chain. My T-bar and chain are properly mounted and secured and present. I'm going to then call out my rubber seal around my fuel tank cap. Make sure it's properly mounted and secured. No abrasions, bulges, or cuts, and no signs of dry rot. Then I'm going to look inside my fuel tank. Make sure that my fuel tank is at the proper level. For argument's sake, it's going to be at half tank. And it should be green, not red. Red is off-road. I'm going to then come to the back of my cab. I'm going to start up at the top. First off, I'm going to make sure that there's no fresh damage on the back of my cab. Then I'm going to start at the top, call out my DOT strips. My DOT strips are properly mounted and secured, clean, clear, and visible. I'm going to come over to my exhaust pipe or smokestack. Make sure that there's no signs of missing nuts or bolts, and there's no signs of black soot, which would indicate an exhaust leak. I'm going to call out my exhaust mount. Make sure it's properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts, and no signs of illegal welds. Since I'm working my way back down, I'm going to call out my catwalk and my stairs. My catwalk and my stairs are properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. Nothing that will cause me to trip, slip, or fall. Then I'm going to call out my tractor protection valve. My tractor protection valve is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. I'm going to then call out my hoses. My hoses are properly mounted and secured. No signs of abrasions, bulges, or cuts. And no signs of dry rot. I'm going to call out, since I'm still talking about my tractor, call out my frame. My frame is properly mounted and secured. Not bent, cracked, or broken. No illegal welds. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. I'm going to then call out my drive shaft. My drive shaft is properly mounted and secured. Not bent, cracked, or broken. No illegal welds. I'm going to call out my universal joint. My universal joint is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. Not bent, cracked, or broken. No signs of illegal welds. Call out my cross members or A-frame support. I'm going to make sure that they're properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. No signs of illegal welds. And I do have 2 of them. Now, if you got your suspension system correctly as you did in the previous axle, all you have to say is I'm going to call out my suspension system the same way as I did in the previous axle. If you got your brakes done the same way, I'm going to call out my brakes the same way as I did in the previous axle. If you called out your tire assembly the same correctly, you're going to call out your tires. I'm going to say that my tires assembly is the same way as I did in the previous axle, with the exception of I got rims that are butted up together. I cannot have more than 2 inches of play in between, or no less than 2 inches of play in between. And instead of a hub seal, I have an axle seal. I cannot check this still. I can only check this. Certified mechanic can only check this. I'm going to check my splash guard. My splash guard is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts, and not damaged. Alright? I'm going to then call out my glad heads. My glad heads are properly mounted and secured. No signs of fresh damage. The rubber grommet that's inside is properly mounted and secured. No signs of dry rot, and no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. Then I'm going to check my service line, or my electrical line. My electrical line is properly mounted and secured. 7 pins for 7 holes. No signs of corrosion. Alright. I'm going to then come down here. I'm going to talk about my 5th wheel. My 5th wheel is properly mounted and secured. No signs of missing nuts or bolts. And my 5th wheel is properly seated around my apron or my trailer. There is no signs of daylight. I'm going to talk about my locking jaw handle or locking jaw lever, that it is properly mounted and secured in the locking position. Talk about my 5th wheel mount. My 5th wheel mount is properly mounted and secured. No signs of illegal welds, not missing any nuts or bolts. Since I'm up under there, I'm going to go ahead and call out my apron. My apron is properly mounted and secured. No signs of illegal welds, not bent, cracked, or broken.
I want to go ahead and do the what's name? What's name? The lab. You got to work on that.
I'm gonna check my header board, make sure my header board is properly, no signs of fresh damage. I'm gonna call out my rivets. My rivets are gonna be properly mounted and secured. I can only miss 1 out of 4. I'm gonna then call out my clearance light. My clearance light up top is properly mounted and secured. No signs of cracked or not cracked or broken, amber in color, and clean clear. I'm gonna call out my DOT strips. I got 2 of them on both sides. I'm gonna make sure that they're clean, clear, and visible, and properly mounted and secured. Now we're gonna do our lab test.
Dropping there?
Still got it rolling?
Huh?
Still got it rolling?
It's on my phone? Yeah, you still
You gonna stand behind him?